This is general feedback for the Euthyphro mini assignment, which was 4M. And in this video, we're going to focus on writing feedback. This is feedback that should apply to any of the assignments you'll write for this course, especially anything that's essay-like. In the other video, I talked about the Euthyphro dialogue in some detail with emphasis on the Euthyphro problem. So if one of your difficulties in writing this assignment was struggling to make sense of the Euthyphro problem, not just identifying the question, but explaining where the question comes from, what's the point, what's the so what. If you were struggling with that, I highly recommend watching the Euthyphro problem or general Euthyphro video. I talked about all 3 paper prompts in this video as well. And in general, it turned out a bit too long, but I think pretty detailed and hopefully clear. So this might be something to look at if that was part of your writing challenge here. And I think it was for a lot of people because the Euthyphro text, especially the bit of text surrounding the Euthyphro problem, is totally tricky. Okay, so in this video, we're going to talk about the intro paragraph, summarizing, with an emphasis on summarizing arguments. I have a couple of do and don'ts. We're going to talk about summary in contrast with going beyond summary, which is something maybe you've been advised to do in your papers before. So I'll say a bit about that, including like how much summary, what to summarize, how to go beyond summary, what exactly does that mean. We'll talk about identifying interesting arguable claims, what it means to have an arguable claim, and maybe a couple of other details. Okay, let's start with the point of the intro paragraph. The point of the intro paragraph depends on what you're introducing. When it comes to typical academic essays, argumentative essays, which is the general format you'll use for this course, and what you'll be introducing is the rest of the paper. That might seem obvious, but when you think about the rest of the paper, what you might want to focus on is what is the point of the paper? What things will you do in the paper? How will you do them? Like situating your reader to understand what is going to happen in this paper. Sometimes I like to think of the introductory paragraph as the kind of thing that you could read on its own and have a sense of what to expect in this paper. More generally, you're going to want to introduce your topic, question, and or claim, right? Bring the reader in. Who is your reader? That's, in general, an important question. And so advice for all of the papers you write for this class, imagine that your reader is not in this class. So that way you have to introduce and explain what you're talking about. In general, you'll find that writing that way will help you to make it clear that you know what you are talking about because you can explain it to somebody who doesn't. Insofar as we're talking about argumentative essays, essays where you have to provide support for claims, I want to emphasize the importance of the guiding question. So any argumentative essay is guided by a question, whether that question is explicitly stated or not. Alternatively, you might think of it as a problem. So argumentative essays provide answers to questions or solutions to problems, or help us to think through questions or problems in a way where we've made some kind of progress in understanding and resolving the question or problem. So when you introduce your essay or paper, one of the most important things to do is bring up a question. Now, again, you don't have to literally state a question, though oftentimes that's a thing you can do, but set up what leads to this question. What is the topic? Where Why are you writing about this? What is the interesting thing that you are responding to, such that you're making a claim? Why are you making the claim that you're making, right? Oftentimes the answer is because the assignment told you to, and you're just trying to figure out what to do. But try not to think about it that way, because it'll help you, because that doesn't really help you think about structuring your intro or the essay as a whole. So let's look at an example. There were 3 prompts. Let's focus on topic number 1, or prompt number 1, because that's what most people wrote about, which had to do with the Euthyphro problem. So the Euthyphro, of course, is a dialogue. It has a structure. If you wrote about topic 1, you're sort of focusing in on a specific place in the Euthyphro dialogue where a question comes up. Now, is the question here, so recall the Euthyphro question, is the pious because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it's pious, right? That's the big question. Is that the question you are answering in this essay? Like, write an essay that examines and responds to this question. Not quite. Your question is about, it's sort of broader and more focused on what happens in the dialogue itself in some sense. So Socrates and Euthyphro are engaged in conversation. Euthyphro has proposed a definition of piety. Socrates raises a question in response to Euthyphro's definition of piety. The order of the because here, pious because God love it, or loved because it's pious. And that is a problem for Euthyphro's proposed definition, right? So that's sort of what's happening here. And our question in this essay is, what should we think about this bit of the conversation? And we can start adding on more and more questions to sort of narrow in on a possible claim. So what should we think about this conversation? What should we think about Euthyphro's proposal? What should we think about the question itself? What should we think about how Euthyphro and Socrates respond to the question? Is this question a problem for the claim? How exactly? What's the best way to resolve it? What are the implications? What should we learn from this part of the dialogue? You're supposed to be able to, so if the prompt has to do with thinking about this bit of the dialogue, you should summarize this bit of the dialogue and then have something to say about it. Something that requires scrutinizing the dialogue, taking a position, and supporting it with reasons. We'll focus more on what makes a good claim and how exactly to support it in a minute, but your question has to do with, like, what is your point in writing this mini essay? Now, you might have really focused in on, oh, so we have this bit of the dialogue, Euthyphro proposes a claim, Socrates raises this interesting question in response to the claim, and my question is, what should we say to that question? I have the same question. In which case, then maybe the Euthyphro question really is your question, in which your goal is to explain where this question comes from in the dialogue and how they answer it, and then continue to try to answer it yourself. Like, that's a thing you could have done in this essay. And that's how most people, I think, interpreted it, but having this extra layer of reflective, like, that is one among many questions I could have picked in response to this essay about the Euthyphro question, is helpful to have. Okay, so if your question for this paper is just the same question that Euthyphro and Socrates consider in response to Euthyphro's second definition, then your claim will also be an answer to this question. Your answer will be either that the pious is pious because the gods love it, or that gods love the pious because it's pious. So then you have to try to support your answer by explaining what's wrong with the answer you didn't choose and what's so great about the answer you did choose, right? But you could have picked a different question, so maybe instead of having the same question, you could ask, in the process of this conversation, Euthyphro just readily agrees with Socrates that gods love the pious thing because it's pious. Should he have done that? Should Euthyphro have gone along? And so maybe your claim is about this specifically. It's pretty similar kind of claim to the other one, but it's a little bit more like, should Euthyphro have done that? Or what are the implications? Never mind what the right answer is, but what are the implications for the argument of the fact that Euthyphro went along with that? Or what, given how this bit of the dialogue goes, like, what do we learn from finding out that this question is, whichever way we try to answer it, is a problem for Euthyphro's definition? What's our so what here? What should we learn? Then your claim would be, we should learn that if we accept assumptions A, B, C, and D, and Euthyphro's question, well then here's what we should conclude about our understanding of the relationship between piety and God's approval or love or something like that. So your claim goes with your question, and your question generally, given the prompt, is, what should I think about this bit of the conversation? Now, what makes for a good, interesting question or claim here is that there's room for reasonable disagreement. So if the question could be answered more than one way, and you could start thinking of reasons why people might go one way or another, that is evidence that it's an interesting question worth developing in a little essay like this. Okay, so we've focused on the question and claim of the intro paragraph. The last thing that I want to say a bit about is the setup. Like, what's the first sentence? What should you do to get to whatever the main question, the big picture of this essay is? How much should I say to get to this point? It can be really difficult to figure out what that first sentence should be, and I asked you to read the Vaughan, which gave some advice for how not to start a paper, and a way to sort of group all of the things on that list together is to use the following rule of thumb. If you could snip off your first sentence or whatever and stick it on any paper, or even any paper that's roughly on this topic, and that first couple of sentences would work just as well, that might be a sign that it's not specific and interestingly connected to what you're going to write about in this paper. So, no, since the beginning of time. You could stick that in front of any paper, and lots of students do. That's not a helpful first sentence. So, don't have something super generic. That's a rule of thumb for getting started. Another rule of thumb for getting started is that you should always introduce stuff before you refer to stuff. So, rules of thumb. Don't be generic, and introduce before you refer. If you are going to talk about a person, a text, an idea, an argument, anything, introduce that thing before just referring to it as if we know who you're talking about or what you're talking about. So that means you're probably going to need to introduce this text. In Plato's Euthyphro, we're talking about Plato's Euthyphro, and you'll, in some sense, introduce the characters instead of just referring to them as if you've already, like, the reader knows what you're talking about. But beyond that, what should you do to set up your main claim? It can help to think about, I think, the guiding question in connection with your main claim. And in this case, our guiding question, you're asked to write about the Euthyphro problem, is what should I think about this bit of the conversation where this Euthyphro problem comes up? And a lot of people focused in on, what should I think about this question that came up in it? What is the right answer here? Pious because loved, or loved because pious? And so if you have a guiding question, like your whole paper is about understanding this, then setting up that question. Now, it doesn't have to be, again, I've already said this, explicitly stated, but what does it take to set that up? Another way of putting it is this. Where does this question come from? So using the example, my question is the Euthyphro question, pious because loved, or loved because pious. I need to say where this question comes from. Well, it comes from Euthyphro's definition number 2. Euthyphro has proposed a definition, and this is a clarificatory question that Socrates raises, which ultimately presents a problem for his definition. So introducing his definition 2 and how it leads to the Euthyphro question might be an interesting thing to do. Very, very briefly, because you'll want to explain that in more detail in the actual body of the paper. But for right now, just where does the question come from? Euthyphro has proposed a definition and Socrates has clarified it, and this clarificatory question is interesting and I'm going to write about it. And I'm going to say X about it. Now, is that a good enough place to start? Euthyphro has proposed that the pious is what the gods love, which leads Socrates to ask a clarificatory question. What do you mean, Euthyphro, that the pious is what the gods love? What is the relationship between God's love and piety? Is it one way or is it the other, right? Well, maybe you have to go back a step further. They have gotten into a conversation about piety, and Euthyphro is asked to provide a definition about piety that he chooses at some point the definition that piety is what the gods love, which leads to a problem, a really interesting problem, a problem I'm going to write about. Okay, so that we end up in a conversation about piety should be something you have to introduce. Now, most people decided to introduce the whole context, right? Why are both of these characters here? What is Euthyphro prosecuting? What is Socrates doing? Blah, blah, blah. And that is perfectly fine. Is it necessary? Not necessarily. So how much do you say to set it up is a choice that you have to make as a writer. And the introduction, like who they are and what they're there for, is really interesting. So that's totally worth including, but that's optional. What really needs to be in here, like you couldn't get away with not having in here, is that they're debating definitions of piety, that Euthyphro has offered one, and that a clarificatory question has arisen in response to this definition that ultimately raises a problem for the definition. What should we think about this question? Okay. So the main points you might want to hit on are, in Plato's Euthyphro, Socrates asks Euthyphro to define piety. Now, how does he come to ask this? Maybe you give more backstory, maybe you don't. But at the very least, it should be clear that they're discussing what piety is. And insofar as you're going to talk about this question that arises, it's important to explain where it comes from. Euthyphro proposes that piety is what the gods love. And when he proposes this, Socrates presses him on the relationship between piety and being God-loved in such a way that we end up with the Euthyphro question or problem or whatever. Okay, so what might an introduction... So this is what you would have to do to get to your question and claim. How might an introductory section look that doesn't even have a question? So say my guiding question is that should Euthyphro have gone along with Socrates when Socrates asked him, why do the gods love the pious? Because it's pious or for some other reason? And Euthyphro immediately says, oh, of course, because it's pious, right? Should he have gone along with that? Now, in order to ask that question, I really need to summarize a lot. So I'm not really going to be able to get to that question clearly until the body paragraph, but that's my guiding question. Should he have gone along with that, let's just say? So in the intro paragraph, I might say, oh, in Plato's Euthyphro, Socrates asks E to define piety. Euthyphro proposes that piety is what the gods love. Socrates presses him on this answer. What is the relationship between piety and what the gods love? In asking Euthyphro to clarify this, Euthyphro readily assents to the gods love piety because it's pious. In so doing, Euthyphro has cornered himself, and I think that he ought not to have accepted this definition. In what follows, I will describe the conversation and how Euthyphro cornered himself where he needn't have. Something like that. So you've introduced a thing, you've got a guiding question, you didn't have to explicitly state it, you just get to what are we talking about and why and what do I have to say about it. Or you can have the question in it if your question just is the Euthyphro question, again, set this up. We're talking about piety. Euthyphro has proposed a definition. It is potentially ambiguous. Socrates presses on him, which brings us to the question. What is this relationship? State the question. Socrates and Euthyphro agree that the answer is one way, and claim. And they are right to do so. And this is the wrong answer. The other answer makes sense, and the fact that they don't consider it is interesting, and I will take that up in this mini essay or something like that. Question, can I write in the first person? A couple of people asked this in their reflection questions, and the answer is yes. In fact, my sense is that most philosophy papers write in the first person. I write in the first person all the time. I'm under the impression that students are often advised not to write in the first person, perhaps because there are some pitfalls to doing so, especially if you get to, oh, well, it's just my opinion, or I think, or I believe, or my feelings are. If you're really trying to walk back your claim, so it's just like, this is my feeling, maybe there are problems with writing in the first person. But if your claim is, I think it's an interesting question whether or not Euthyphro should have accepted, and what if he hadn't? In this paper, I will examine, blah, blah, blah. So long as you are making claims and then backing them up with reasons, first person isn't a problem, and in fact, it makes sense to write in first person a lot of the time. If you are uncomfortable writing in first person, try it out. I will circle it and let you know if it doesn't work, and we'll learn. But yes, you can write in first person. Okay, let's move on to summary, which was supposed to be your second paragraph, summarizing the argument. So there are some tips I can give you about summarizing arguments specifically, some do's and don'ts, and then we'll talk about what exactly goes in the summary and how much should you be summarizing. Actually, let's start with how much. How much? It depends. What does it depend on? It depends on your focus for the essay. So if you're asked to summarize and analyze the whole dialogue, well, then you have to summarize the whole dialogue. And maybe you do it in parts. Maybe you summarize the intro, analyze, definition 1, summarize, then analyze, definition 2, like maybe you do each one or whatever. But that's not what you're asked to do in this paper. In this paper, you're asked to focus in on something. And one of the things, topic 1, asked you to focus in on is this Euthyphro question part of the dialogue. So how much of this dialogue, where do you want to get started? How much are you going to include? And one question you have to decide is, do you want to start with definition 2 and talk about disagreement, so we get to revise definition 3, where piety is what all the gods love, and then get to the Euthyphro question and where they go with it and what the so what is? Or do you want to sort of just skip the disagreement stuff and start with kind of like, he's got this definition, piety is what the gods love, yeah, in particular what all the gods love. And let's just summarize this little bit. What is the question? How does it arise? How do they deal with it? And what's the so what? What does it mean for Euthyphro's definition? And this is probably the right answer. Could you have gone with this? Yes. Should you do any more than that? No. You're focusing on just this Euthyphro question. So you'll want to summarize this part. Okay, so that's the how much. It depends on what you're supposed to be saying or what you want to be saying or whatever the case may be. Okay, so once you've decided what needs summarizing, how do you summarize it? Well, your summary should have some kind of logical structure. And that might depend on the kind of thing you're summarizing. The structure of a story is different from the structure of a series of events or a timeline, and that's different from the structure of an argument. Stories have beginning, middle, and ends. They have climaxes and resolutions, sort of important structural features that you might need to include in a plot summary. And a series of events is structured in terms of timeline, or one after another, or if it's instructions, order of operations. And that's not true of an argument. So when it comes to do's and don'ts, the number one thing you can check is don't just list things that happened in order. That's the most common piece of advice that I have for summaries. This is just a list of things that happened in order. The other most common thing that students do in summarizing that doesn't really provide a great summary of an argument is something, I don't know what to call it, but I have chosen superficial play-by-play, which is where Socrates then totally undermines Euthyphro's claim. They go back and forth, Euthyphro says some more things, Socrates keeps shooting it down, and ultimately we end up with no definition. So we've got a play-by-play of what happened, and it's, roughly accurate, but a reader who hasn't read the text might be like, what was the claim? What was wrong with it? Why did Socrates shoot it down? Was there a problem with the claim? Was Socrates right or wrong to do so? I don't know what he said, so how do I know how to think about any of this? So give the actual details. What was claimed? What was found lacking? Why? So no superficial play-by-plays, that's not very helpful. Okay, so how should you structure a summary of an argument? What is the structure of an argument? It's not just a list of things that are claimed, it's a list of things that are claimed in support of something, right? So when you are talking about the structure of an argument, there will be claims, either the main claim, the conclusion, or support for conclusions, but there are claims, and there are either reasons for claims, or there are conclusions that are drawn from claims, a so what. There are relationships between the things being claimed. So if you're going to summarize the argument, start by asking, for various things that are said along the way, why think that? Have I been given reason to think that? Why think that? Or, so what? Socrates concludes that this question, blah, 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 specific claims he says, so what? What's the point of all of this? And the Okay, so the setup, Euthyphro has proposed a definition, that's crucial, and Socrates is concerned about the relationship between the two things in the definition. So Euthyphro said, piety is what all the gods love. And Socrates is asking, well, wait, what exactly is the relationship between piety and being loved by the gods, being God-loved? Is, let's say, prayer. Is prayer pious because it's God-loved, or God-loved because it's pious? And ultimately argues that along the way, that we don't get a satisfactory answer to this question, so this definition needs more clarification or work, and we haven't found a clarification that works yet. So here are the premises or claims that are relevant to showing there's a problem with this definition. That's the conclusion. This definition is problematic. Why? Here are the relevant claims. 1. The definition is potentially ambiguous, needs clarification. Possibility number 1. Pious things are pious because the gods love them. Possibility number 2. Gods love these things because they are pious. Now this is where we get into sort of the nitty-gritty. A thing is God-loved because it's being loved by the gods. This is the most simple point ever when it comes, not easy to understand, but really it's hard because it's so simple. A carried thing is only a carried thing insofar as something is carrying it. A God-loved thing is God-loved if the gods love it, right? So what it means to be God-loved is that gods in fact love this thing, right? Okay, so, and piety is God-loved, granted, And one thing that means, like, insofar as it's God-loved, in fact, the gods love it. But why do the gods love it? Because it's pious or for some other reason? And Euthyphro readily admits, well, because it's pious. But this doesn't answer our question then. It seems like being God-loved just isn't the same concept as being pious. Maybe all of the pious things are God-loved, and maybe all the things gods love are pious. Like, let's make a list. Maybe everything on this list is in fact pious and is in fact loved by the gods. What it means to say that it's God-loved is that in fact the gods are actively loving these things on the list. But insofar as we want to know why they love what's on this list, not their being pious is what makes them love it. It makes them God-loved, the fact that the gods love it, but why are these things pious? What makes them pious? Why do the gods love these things for their piety? Insofar as that's an open question, it looks like piety, even if all the same things are in the piety list and the God-loved list, everything in the list has both properties, being pious isn't the same thing as being God-loved. And as a kind of analogy to how two things can share, how a list of things can have all the same properties, but not, those properties are not the same. Imagine a list of mammals. Every mammal on the list has a heart, and every mammal on the list has, say, kidneys. That doesn't mean that hearts and kidneys are the same thing. It just means that everything on the list has both, right? So everything on this list is pious and God-loved, but that doesn't mean those concepts are the same concept. So we seem to not have figured out what piety is, just that everything that is pious is God-loved, assuming that there are gods and that we know what they love and that they love things non-arbitrarily. Which means we haven't answered our question and we still don't know what piety is, right? And that's the main conclusion. Euthyphro has proposed a definition, and there's a clarification that needs to be made in order to understand the definition. No matter how we clarify it, it seems like we haven't answered the question, so we conclude that Euthyphro's definition is a problem. There's a structure worth capturing here when you summarize it. Now, one really difficult thing for summarizing this argument is the argument is complicated, and so maybe you didn't really understand the structure of it, and that's why you weren't able to super clearly capture the structure of the argument. And that's totally okay. And watch the other video if you are interested in having the details of the argument explained. Okay, and then let's end again with how much. So, how much depends on, in part, what the prompt is, but also on your claim. You need to summarize what needs to be said for your claim to make sense. If you are going to be analyzing this argument, so maybe your claim is just, how should we answer the Euthyphro question? You might be able to get away with not summarizing anything if you're just like, I'm pulling this question out of it and I don't really care what they said, I'll analyze it by myself. That might be a thing you could do. In fact, the Euthyphro question has been pulled out of the text and interpreted as an interesting question in its own right and given a sort of different setup. If you Googled the Euthyphro problem and you found modern sort of characterizations of this problem in terms of divine command theory, that argument looks really different from what we find in the text. It would be like going with the introduction and Euthyphro is charging his father for murdering a murderer. And if you were like, that's an interesting question. Is murdering a murderer wrong? And you just sort of ignore the rest of the text because you found an interesting question. And you might say like, oh, in the Euthyphro, this is an example of where this is happening. But now I'm going to go off and write a whole essay examining the what's the problem with murdering a murderer. Like, that could be a fine thing to do if you're just making an interesting argument and this is historically just where it comes from and you're mentioning it, but that's not really key part of your own reasoning, fine. But for an assignment like this, Your goal is to deeply engage with the text. So just pulling the question out of the text and then analyzing it on its own independently of the text for your own purposes isn't the goal of this particular assignment. So in this assignment, you should be summarizing some amount of the text because you have something to say about the text. And you can't say something about the text if you haven't explained the thing you're about to talk about. So you are summarizing for a purpose because you have something to say. How much depends on what you have to say. Summarize the thing you're going to talk about. If you find that you went on to not talk about a thing you summarized, then it looks like you didn't really need it, right? So think about doing things for reasons. Okay, so oftentimes you're asked to go beyond summary or not summarize too much. So continuing to think about, summarizing for a purpose matters. Now, figuring out how much to summarize and what you have to say about it can be a kind of back and forth process. So maybe you don't know what you want to say ahead of time. So just start summarizing to the best of your ability, capturing the structure of an argument and trying to explain this argument in the clearest way you can, like you're teaching it to somebody who isn't familiar with the text. And as you're doing that, be asking yourself, so what? What should I think about this argument? What questions do I have about the argument? Why is so-and-so saying this? Does this really follow? So what? And why should I think that? Or how does this connect with? Blah, blah, blah. So ask yourself questions as you're trying to explain. Once you've hit upon a question that you want to delve into, summarize the amount that you need to summarize in order to productively talk about the question you've raised, about the thing you're summarizing. You might find that you summarized way too much, and so you can sort of condense the summary that you didn't really need after you've decided what to talk about. Or you might find that you headed off in a question where you have to go back and summarize more. So it might be a back and forth process. If you don't know what you want to say, just start by summarizing and explaining the best you can and figure it out that way. So be asking yourself questions as you're trying to explain the text. That's a good strategy. A rule of thumb that's helpful here. Summarize before you analyze or evaluate the text. And so this is why I suggested the 3-paragraph structure for this little mini essay, and that paragraph 2 was supposed to be just summary, and paragraph 3 was supposed to be the part where you go beyond summary. And many people's summaries were sort of mixed in with analysis and evaluation. Sometimes the line between summary and analysis isn't super clear because it requires some amount of interpretation. So what exactly does Socrates mean here? Sometimes it's open to interpretation. What does he mean? Or say the parts where he's being ironic or something like that. What does he mean and what's the so what? That's borderline between summary and analysis. So think about the borderline this way. Is there room for interesting rational disagreement? So what does Socrates mean when he says this? Well, he could mean a couple of things and it matters. Well, then that's probably interpretation and analysis, and you should support how you are interpreting it with reasons. Why think of it that way, and so what? In which case it's not just straightforward summary. You should summarize before you do that. But otherwise, just generally don't mix in your attempt to present and explain what actually happened in the text and then make claims about what we should think about what happened in the text, how we should interpret it, how we should evaluate it. Does the conclusion follow? Blah, 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 that kind of thing. Separate that out, because the whole point of summarizing is to present the material that you are going on to analyze and evaluate. So interpretation or analysis and evaluation, these things are claims that require support. Your reasoning, things about which readers could interestingly and productively disagree, that would have interesting implications for how we understand the argument or the text or something like that. That kind of thing is what it means to go beyond summary, and you should do that after you have summarized. Okay, identifying interesting arguable claims. We've already hit on this a bit, but just to recap a few points that were made. What do I mean by arguable? Something like there's room for interesting, productive disagreement such that you should support interpreting or evaluating something one way as opposed to some other way or ways. Now, does any actual person need to disagree with you? No, like you could disagree with yourself. So if you could imagine, if you are not sure which way to go, as in there's more than one interesting way and it seems like a tough choice, that's a great position to be in, because then you can kind of see what makes it a tough choice and reasons for going one way or another, which means it's probably an interesting, productive question to ask. So this is a property that your claim should have if you're going to have anything to say about it, and if it's the kind of thing that will require reasoning and support and the consideration of objections and alternative perspectives and opinions. But there might be reasons to focus claims in certain ways, or you might have to respond to certain kinds of topics, or the writing assignment might have certain goals, and that can influence how you choose your claim. So question, are you supposed to be thinking about a specific text idea or argument? If so, there's a lot less room for your choice of a claim. And whatever claim you do choose should be tightly connected to and responsive to the thing you're supposed to be thinking about. And usually the purpose of an assignment that is like requiring you to focus on this specific text is supposed to be like, maybe a goal is to deepen your understanding of that text through writing about it, or to demonstrate that you do understand the text. So choosing a claim whereby you have to demonstrate and develop your understanding of the text, because that's something that you need to have. You need to have a good understanding of the text in order to be able to do interesting analysis and evaluation of that text. You're going to want to make sure your claim is arising from your attempts to explain and grapple with that text. Another question is, how much space do you have, right? So how specific or general or big or small your question is a matter of how much space you have. So for a 3-paragraph mini essay, you don't have a lot of space, so you don't have to say a whole lot, and that can make your claim super narrow. You want it to be tightly engaged with the text you're supposed to be understanding, and narrow so you can actually develop the thing you're saying instead of making too big of a claim that you can't possibly defend in a paragraph. Sometimes you have a lot more leeway in what to write about, where you aren't supposed to be demonstrating that you understand this really specific section of a specific text or a specific text as a whole, but rather you have engaged with and understand some larger background conversation. Maybe that background conversation is something that's been chosen. Here's a debate between 3 people. Demonstrate that you understand the debate and have something to say about it and figure out where you fit in. And sometimes you're not given the background conversation. Instead, you're supposed to identify an interesting question and then go figure out what people have been saying about that question and analyze what people have said, evaluate what people have said, and then figure out what you think and where it fits into this conversation. In any case, you're looking for areas of interesting, productive disagreement. They could be very narrow or not. They could engage with specific texts or not. Most of the time, I will point you to specific texts or background conversations that you are supposed to engage with. So if you are pulling something out of a text like, oh, is murdering a murderer bad? And that doesn't engage with any depth of what we've been covering in class, that's probably like, yeah, that's an interesting question. And you could go out and start researching it in a very open-ended assignment where the goal is just to develop an argument in context with, or in conversation with other people writing about this topic, then you could choose that. But that's probably not going to be an awesome question for this class because it's just too disconnected from the details that we are actually talking about, the arguments we're talking about. Now, insofar as I've brought up texts and background conversations as relevant to your main claims, I wanted to end on talking about sources. So, how are you thinking about sources? One way we use sources is to support our claims, right? So, especially if your source has a fact or a statistic or something that is relevant to your claim, we can find sources to support our claims. Now, finding somebody that has that holds the same view as us doesn't support our claims. We're not going to appeal to authority to argue for the kinds of claims that we're considering in a philosophy class. These interesting, open, productive disagreement kinds of questions and claims are not the kind of thing that you can just appeal to authority to answer. So sources don't provide us support for our claims, usually. And instead, we use sources because they have also been thinking about the questions we're thinking about. And so we want to know, what have other people thought about and said about this? We're not thinking and writing in a vacuum. We're thinking and writing about context, or about questions and claims that other people have also explored and given reasons for thinking about one way or another. And so when you're looking for sources, you're looking for things that people have claimed and how they've argued for it so that you can build on or object to or synthesize with or do something with their claims to figure out what you think in connection with the things that one could possibly think. So, sources and citations. You're supposed to be, throughout this class, you will be engaging with sources, engaging with ideas, not just like proving you read them or understood them or using them to support your own claim, but developing your thinking in connection with the arguments and ideas that you find in various sources. It's really important to know how to summarize, how to integrate arguments and summary into your own writing, into the development of your own thinking and ideas. And it's important to do so while citing. Now, what's the purpose of citations? It's not just give credit where credit is due. Like, I'm not worried about Plato getting credit where credit is due. What I'm interested in, and it's not just to prove that you haven't plagiarized, though it's important to develop your own thinking and not plagiarize, right? So that's important, but it's a good practice to get into because you are referring to things that other people think when you write about a really interesting question, and people who are reading your writing might be interested in the stuff you were referring to, want to go back and check. So if you say that Socrates is attempting to clarify the relationship between these things, and you paraphrase and provide a source, I might go back to that passage and try to make sense of it myself as I'm grappling with trying to understand what you're saying and why, because I care about what you think. And in general, when you start writing and reading in an academic context, you follow people's citations to learn more about it yourself. So be keeping track of citations and using them. And in general, it's really important to think about providing citations for all of your sources, not just the texts that you were asked to write with. As I've indicated in the passing criteria, I want you to provide citations and links for all sources because this is a learning context, right? Writing with sources and figuring out how to use sources and developing your thinking is a skill, and I can be helpful when I know what you're trying to use to develop your thinking. So what exactly needs to be included? A prime example comes up in writing about the Euthyphro. So I suggested that you use no sources other than the Euthyphro. And by that, I didn't just mean you don't have to have citations, like no other citations or people writing about the Euthyphro. I meant don't even Google it. Just sit with the text and try to make sense of it. And it's okay if you get it wrong. Like, the passing criteria isn't have perfect understanding of Euthyphro. It's grapple with it and try to summarize what happened in the text to the best of your ability. Now, it's clear to me that most people, I would say at least half, it was very clear that you must have Googled it and tried to make sense of it. And I understand that that is like almost like a compulsion in our age. Like, we Google things to make sense of it. We read, and that's also part of like learning, is to wanting to see examples, wanting to see what other people have said. It's in part why I have you post your writing assignments to an open thread so you can look at each other's work. Like, seeing samples and examples of what people said is okay. Like, that's part of the learning process, but that is something that I want you to be citing. Now, I could tell that people must have been Googling Euthyphro because the modern discussions of the Euthyphro problem don't really engage with the dialogue specifically. That question comes up with the dialogue, and an interesting question is raised here, and that's why it becomes known as the Euthyphro question and ultimately the Euthyphro problem. But how that question is used and what the point of it is, how it becomes interpreted as a dilemma, like all of that is sort of separate from what actually happened in the text itself. So if you were writing about divine command theory, essentially, you were probably looking at sources because you were trying to figure out what the heck is happening in this text. It's hard, right? So you should have included those sources. And in general, it's okay to be trying to grapple with and make sense of that. Just include the things you're using as you grapple and try to make sense of things, right? Do your best to put things in your own words and share what you're using to learn, because I can be a much better instructor if I know what things you're trying to do to learn. So, cite all of your sources. Provide citations for things, an important clarification. For paraphrases, as well as direct quotations. My advice is, unless you have a really good reason, don't use direct quotations at all. Like, sometimes you have a really good reason for it. I'm talking about what so-and-so said, and I need to say what they said. Fine. But rule of thumb, paraphrase over direct quotation, and they need citations. So here's another rule of thumb. If you can point, I mean literally point, to words or ideas, they need a citation. So if you can point to exactly the spot where Socrates said this, or Euthyphro proposed his second definition, like you can put your finger on it, whether you're pointing at the screen or pointing at a page, cite it. If you're summarizing something, you don't, let's say the whole dialogue, you don't have to include page numbers 10 through 50 or whatever, because you've cited the whole you're referring to the thing you've cited to. Sometimes you'll cite a couple of pages, as in like this happened in these 3 pages. If it's interestingly less than the whole book or chapter or paper or dialogue, you can give a page range. But the basic rule of thumb, which is mostly right, is if you can point to it. Now maybe you need to sort of generally point to it if it's 2 pages or something, but like I can point to where this was said, it needs a citation. With page numbers. And when when we're referring to Plato, we'll use Stephanus numbers. So that way we're all on the same page, because there are a bunch of translations of Plato's works. Okay, that's the end. I hope that this was useful for thinking about writing generally. Not this particular essay, which was a practice essay that dealt with a difficult text, but I hope that this helps for thinking about organizing your writing for all essay-ish kinds of assignments that you'll do in this class, and we'll do quite a few.